All right, you guys, we are ready to start making our slab mug. Before we get started, we want to make sure we have all of the materials we'll need for this project. For step one, the first material is we need to make sure that we have our fabric and we have it laid on a nice flat, smooth surface. We'll not be rolling on top of our bat because we don't want our slab to get the impressions of any kind of textures on our bat. So make sure you've got a nice smooth surface, large work area. So we have our fabric laid down. We'll want our rolling pin, should be nice and clean. Then we also need guide sticks. So a couple options. Your number 2 pencils that you received work perfectly as guide sticks. They are the 1/4 of an inch thickness that we need our clay slab to be. So those will work perfectly, and then we can roll on top of those. The other option you might have in your house is a couple of these plastic hangers, which are also 1/4 of an inch thickness. So you could use 2 of these hangers, lay them down, clay in the middle, and roll on top. So up to you, but make sure that you have 2 matching guide sticks in order to get your clay rolled out evenly. We'll of course want all of our tools as well as our slip and or water. Your clay, we're going to have probably about 2 pounds of clay for this project. A lot of it will be scrap and go back in the scrap bag, but you need a lot of extra to start to make sure that your slab is going to be the right size and large enough. And then lastly, you need a template. So for this particular project, we want our mugs to be at least standard size. And for that standard size, it will be 4 1/4 by 11. And what that is basically just a standard sheet of computer paper folded exactly in half. And then you can cut it out. Okay? If you want your mug to be a little bit bigger, a little bit taller or wider, that is totally okay. You'll just need to make your own template. And then once you cut out your template, go ahead and curl it and make sure that the ends line up. So you don't want one end to be much longer than the other. You want the ends to line up so it'll be a perfect cylinder. And then also check that you're happy with the size, the height, the width. Remember, you want to be able to fit your hand inside or at least close to it for easy blending and cleaning. Okay, so go ahead and grab all of those materials: fabric, guide sticks, 2 guide sticks, rolling pin, create your template, 2 pounds of clay, and then make sure all of your tools and materials are set out ready to go, and we'll get started. Okay, so next step before we start rolling this out, a couple things we want to go over. So you have your 2 pounds of clay. It should be wedged. So if you've just sliced off clay straight from your bag and that's what's sitting on your table right now, you need to take a minute to prepare your clay. Because most likely it might be a little bit more dry on the inside and then maybe have some moisture around the outside where you've been hydrating it. So before you start, you'll want to wedge it. So this is a slightly larger piece than we've wedged before, so just a couple reminders. For wedging is to kind of create like a block form, okay? And then with your hands on both sides, you're going to rock your form up, and with your palms, push down, and then rock it up, and then rotate your hands and push down again, and continue that process. So I'm pushing in and I'm pushing downwards. Okay, so you can kind of see that I'm folding the clay over on itself. There's lots of different ways to wedge. So you'll just need to practice. So you'll do this several times. I've already wedged mine for time's sake, so I'm just going to go ahead and finish. But you would want to repeat that process several times, maybe changing direction, fold your clay over, make sure you don't have any slimy areas. Okay, So now we've got our clay wedged, ready to go. We are ready to start rolling. So when rolling, again, we have our fabric laid down on a nice smooth surface. There's no wrinkles. We also have our guide sticks. So if you don't have anything else, these pencils work perfectly. They're the exact thickness that we want. Also, like I said, if you happen to have hangers, these are great because they are a little bit longer, so you don't have to move the pencils up and down. So if you're using pencils, you might start on one side and then move the pencils down and roll the bottom. So it's just a little extra work, but if it's all you have, then that works perfectly. So I've got my fabric laid down, my clay, my guide sticks, and my rolling pin. I will note right now that for rolling, you want to stand up. So I know you can't see me right now, but I'm standing up and my shoulders are directly over my clay. You can kind of see my shadow right now. So you don't want to be sitting down and trying to roll in front of you. You're not going to get very even pressure. So you want to have your rolling pin and your shoulders directly over your rolling pin so that the weight of your body and your arms push down and you'll get nice even thickness. Okay, so go ahead and set that up right now. Get into a good standing position and then we'll get started. All right, so next step is rolling out our clay. So we have this ball of clay now, it's wedged. The first thing we're going to do is push it down with the flat palm of our hand. Push it down into a slightly smaller pancake shape, because trying to roll out a really thick piece of clay is going to be frustrating and take a lot of energy, which we don't really want to do if we don't have to. So I'm going to kind of squish that down. Reminder, we want to have our clay a longer, skinnier piece. So I've kind of already started to direct the clay versus just a big round pancake. If you roll it out into a circle, it may not be long enough for you. So I'm squishing that clay down nice and flat, and then I will flip it over like a pancake to make sure that it's not sticking to my clay, or the clay isn't sticking to the fabric. Release it and make sure that the clay is going to stretch. You never just want to let your clay sit in one place and roll back and forth in one direction. It's not going to stretch very evenly. All right, so now we're ready to roll. So I always like to start in the middle. Again, make sure your rolling pin is nice and clean. Start in the middle and roll upwards. Again, nice even pressure. And then come back to the middle and roll downwards. Okay, so I've got a good roll here. So I'm just going to go ahead and check and make sure that my slab is wide enough, and it's definitely long enough. I already have some extra here. So to make my life a little bit easier, I'm going to go ahead and just trim off some of that extra clay that I don't need right now. And these scraps, we'll just spray them down with a mister or just a little bit of water and put them directly back into your clay bag, and we'll be able to use them later. Okay, so I've got one roll in. I'm going to go ahead and lift it from the fabric. So take one end, carefully peel it away so you don't distort or stretch the shape, and then go ahead and lay it down again. Again, checking, make sure there's no wrinkles in the fabric. And then we'll go ahead and give it another roll. So this clay is still stretching a little bit, which means it was not quite the right thickness. It still has some movement down here. So you might need to do this several times depending on how much you push, how much clay you have, but just continue that process. Flip it back and forth, roll it up and down, trim off any extra. Keep comparing it to your template. Make sure it's going to be wide enough. You might need to roll it side to side a little bit. But the key here is to always make sure that your rolling pin sits on top of your guide sticks. If you have your guide sticks too far apart, then you're just rolling on top of your clay, and you can easily push too hard and make your slab way too thin, and it'll be uneven and we'll have cracking issues. So the point of our guide sticks is that our rolling pin sits on top of our guide sticks, so when we roll, our clay will never get thinner than the thickness of our guide stick, which is 1/4 of an inch and exactly the thickness that we want. So you'll know when you've got the right thickness when you just roll back and forth. You can hear the rolling pin on top of your guide sticks, and your clay doesn't make any other kind of movement or impression from your rolling pin. And I could just easily roll that up and down now. It's just rolling on my guide sticks. Okay? So that is our next step. All right, you guys, so next we are ready to cut out our slab using our template. Before we cut it out, there is an extra step that I would highly encourage you to do, and that is compressing the surface of your clay. So if you remember the other video we watched, she was using a rib tool. Now I know I did not supply you guys with rib tools. Several of you were able to find some of these old gift cards that you can use as a rib tool. You might have trimmed them into a curved shape, and you can use this as your rib tool. If you don't have anything like this, a card, you can simply just use your fingers and drag your fingers across the surface of your clay. You can notice one side is now a lot more smooth and the other side has that slight texture. So either one, using that to drag across the surface of your clay, to compress the surface, remove any textures from your fabric, any scrapes, and then also compressing the surface so that when we curl the clay, it will not crack as easily. Okay, so I'm just going to do that to my entire surface here, and then flip the clay over carefully so you don't distort your slab. Flip it over, and we'll do the same to this side. So you want to do this to the inside and the outside so that your clay will be smooth both on the inside of your mug and the outside of your mug. So any scratches you might have, you can remove those. Okay, and then again, if you just take your finger and you can smooth that out as well. Okay. So at this point, if you were interested in including any kind of texture, impressions, if you had stamps, if you had a roller, some texture fabric that you wanted to impress into your clay, this would be the stage that you would want to do that. I know many of you experienced difficulties trying to push into the outside of your pinch pot, and it distorts your form. So we would want to do this at the flat stage. So if you wanted to do that, you can go ahead and create your textures on your slab at this point if you wanted an overall texture. Otherwise, we can always wait till later, and then you can add some carvings or textural designs later. Or maybe you want to just leave it smooth and have just a normal functional mug. Okay, so both my sides are compressed, and I am ready to go ahead and trim out my slab. So like I said, you will probably have a slab that's a little bit larger than what you actually need, which is good. So if you have a slab that's maybe a little bit too long, what I like to do is trim off of the very end. That way I have a little bit of extra slab up here that I can use for my base. If you don't have extra, that's totally okay. You can just roll another slab at that time. So what we want to do is we want to place our template right on top of our clay, press it down so that it sticks, and then we'll go ahead and trim it out. You can decide which tool is going to work better for you, possibly one of your pointed modeling tools, or maybe your needle tool, or even just a toothpick. but something that is thin that you can cut your clay out with. Okay, so I'm going to use the needle tool, and when I cut, notice that I am cutting straight up. Okay, so I'm making a squared edge for now. My tool isn't at an angle. Okay, we want to try to keep our slabs consistent. So I've got this extra piece here that I can just reserve for my base. So I'm going to go ahead and set that to the side, cover it in plastic so it doesn't dry out, and I'll use that next. All right, so then I'm going to go ahead and just continue to cut this out. Again, remembering to keep my tool at an even height so I don't cut any weird angles. I'll go ahead and cut the other side. Remove that scrap and then cut the very end. Okay. And so again, all of these scraps right now, you can spritz them with a spray bottle, add a little water. Again, throw these scraps back into the bag right away so they stay nice and plastic. All right. So now we can peel our template up. If for some reason your paper may have stuck to your clay, maybe you left it on too long, that's totally okay. The paper will just burn away in the kiln, so no worries. But you might want to use that for the inside of your bowl if you're doing texture on the outside. Okay, so now we have our slab for our clay mug. So like I said, there's a couple things that we want to think about before we actually start building the mug. If at this point, again, you wanted to add some texture, some surface design, you could go ahead and do that. One important thing to remember is that you do not want to have any kind of texture around the top of your mug. Because when drinking, if you had a really bumpy or pokey texture that would sit on your lip, that would be quite uncomfortable. So we want to avoid that. So either add the texture to one side, or if you've added a texture, you can go ahead and smooth out that top probably 1/2 inch at least to make room for your lip to be comfortable. The other thing we can do at this point is thin out the lip and round it. We can easily do this later, but I like to do it now. It just makes it even easier. So you want to decide which side is the top and which side is the bottom. If you have one side that's already looking maybe a little bit better than the other, that would be a good choice for the top. Since the bottom will be blending, adding a coil, we can kind of fix those imperfections. So I'm going to go ahead and choose this as my top. So this will be my lip. And what I'm going to do is I can either just take my finger, I can take my rib tool, or even a popsicle stick, and compress and round out that corner. So I'm just going to use my finger so you can see it a little bit better. All right, so I'm going to take my finger and place it right on the corner of my clay and gently push down right on the corner, basically just running my finger down the edge. So I'm getting rid of that sharp 90-degree angle. So I'll just do that a couple of times. Again, try to be consistent with your pressure. So you're not necessarily squishing the clay or making it any thinner. You're just rounding out that corner. Then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. So I'm just going to flip it over and do the same on the other side. So now that you've got your slab cut out exactly how you want to be really careful about gently peeling it up, using both hands, laying it down on a nice smooth surface. So I'm going to do the same thing again. This is my lip. So I'm going to use the same technique, run my finger down and smooth out that edge. Okay, so then if I notice any other little scratches or anything, I can go ahead and fix those up, tidy up a texture, anything that I wanted to do. And now I'm ready to move on to the next step. Okay, so next step is to create our bevel cut. So we want to create a bevel cut on one end, and we want to create the same bevel cut on the opposite end. So we want those bevels to overlap. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and turn my slab to the side so it might be a little bit easier for you to see. So since we don't have that fancy bevel cut tool that she had, we're going to use our knife. Knife, needle tool, popsicle stick, whatever it is that you have, but something thin. You could also use the wire tool if you wanted to maybe move this up to the edge of the table and cut it that way. But the needle tool works just great. So what you want to do is you want to use your tool, create that 45-degree angle. And what I'm doing is I am laying the clay, let's see if I can stand this up, laying the clay so that my tool is going to cut along that bottom corner, and it's just going to cut off a little triangle of clay. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do that now and show you what that looks like. Okay, so it's positioned to cut the bottom. So I'm just going to use my fingers to help guide. So you're just going slow and you're making sure that the bottom of the needle tool is cutting that very bottom edge. And I'm holding the slab down here so that when I pull, I don't stretch the clay. Okay, so basically you can see I've cut that little triangle out, and now my slab has an angle to it. Okay, so I want to do that same exact thing to the other side. In this case, though, we want it to be an undercut. So two options. You can just simply take your tool and undercut it, so the same direction. So make sure it's at the same angle. Simply move it over and you can cut underneath. This time you're following the top corner and cutting out what's underneath. Okay, so I'll just do half so you guys can see that I'm cutting out underneath. Okay, if that seems a little too tricky for you, you could simply just flip the slab over carefully and then cut from the top, just like you did before. So you could turn it around and cut from the top. So whichever is easier for you. And then again, these scraps right now, they're still plastic. Mist them down and put them back into your scrap bag so they stay nice and moist and don't dry out. Okay. So now we have our two ends beveled. We've got a bevel cut, one on the top, one undercut. We have our bottom right here, and we have our lip at the top. So just make sure you're keeping track of which side is which so that you construct your mug appropriately. So next step is we want to join our two ends together. So I'll show you what that will look like. Okay, so when we overlap, those two edges are going to join and slightly overlap at an angle. And that will be a lot better for strength and then also easier to blend. So again, before we actually connect the two, we always want to follow that three-step process: score, slip, then blend. So what we're going to do is go ahead and score. So get my scoring tool out. We'll go ahead and score our bevel cut edge. And I'm going to score this edge as well. I'm just going to flip it over so you guys can see it. Score. And because this clay still is quite plastic, or at least it should be quite plastic, you don't need a lot of slip. So just a little bit of slip on the top. Slip or water if for some reason you don't have slip. Okay, so just a little bit of slip on the top. I like to go over and just score that one more time, just make it a little extra goopy sticky. And now we're ready to attach. So this is the point where you want to be really careful about moving the clay so you don't stretch the clay or distort the shape. So using both hands very carefully, supporting the structure of the wall, stand it up, curl it into a cylinder, and then you can overlap those joints. Okay, so my head is directly above the clay, so I can see that my joints have been lined up, and I'm just slowly going through and pushing in that seam. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and grab my bat because it'll be a lot easier to work with when the fabric isn't flinging around. Okay, so I now have a cylinder, and our next steps is blending. So we scored, we slipped, and now we want to blend. So everyone is definitely going to be blending the inside. So we have that inside seam, and particularly in mugs that we know for sure are going to be very functional, we want to make sure that the inside is totally smooth so that it doesn't retain any kind of food particles. It'll be easy to clean. So I'm just using my modeling tool as kind of an extended finger. You could just use your finger if you're able to fit your hand in there, but I just like to use the modeling tool. It's just a little bit easier for me. If for some reason you can't reach down all the way down to the bottom, you could simply flip it over. Just a reminder, treat it like a baby. Use both hands. Be very careful. Flip it over, and then I can get the rest of that seam and blend it out so it's nice and smooth. Okay, so you can first go side to side to blend the clay, and then you can run vertical to smooth out any kind of texture marks. Okay, so the whole inside should be totally nice and smooth, and you don't see that seam anymore. Okay, for the outside, that is going to be your choice. So if you like that kind of texture, you like to be able to see the seam, you're welcome to leave it there. If you don't like the seam, you want it to just be one nice smooth mug, at this time you can go ahead and blend it out. So I'm just going to do a little bit of blending. I'll probably leave a little bit of the seam visible just so you guys can see in the future what I might be talking about. And then you can kind of blend out the top, the lip. Smooth it out so we don't have any cracks. Okay. All right. So now we have our cylinder. Try to get it into a nice even circle. And now we're ready to create our base. All right, so next step is we are going to create a base for our mugs. So I previously had this extra piece of leftover from my original slab. If you did not, you'll just repeat that same process of your fabric, your guide sticks, and roll out a new slab of clay. It's really important that you get the same exact thickness. You want the thickness of your slab to be totally consistent. Match that 1/4 of an inch thickness that we want all the way throughout. We don't want to have any thin or thick areas because we'll definitely end up with some cracks in these mugs. So make sure it's a nice evenly rolled thickness slab that matches the thickness of your mug. So this was the slab I had earlier. I'm just going to do a couple touch-ups with this, smooth out any kind of cracks I got or little scratches I got from covering up in plastic. Do that to the other side as well. So again, compressing the surface. Again, you could just use your finger and remove any kind of creases or scratches or anything like that. Okay, and so the easiest way to create your base is to simply pick up carefully with both hands your cylinder and place it on top of your slab. Okay, so you do want to make sure that you putz for a minute and get it to be a perfect circle. So it's not like an oval shape, it's not wonky. Okay, I don't know if you can see in that you want to look inside, get directly over the top of your mug and make sure the inside looks like a perfect circle. So if you need to pop part of it out, if you need to pop part of it in. Okay. All right, and then the next step is to simply trace around. So you can take your needle tool, your toothpick, anything, and just lightly trace. I would recommend not carving right away, just in case you don't want to dig into your cylinder and make any oopsies. So we'll just remove that. And then now that you've got your tracing, you can go ahead and cut it out. So at this point, remember you want to make sure that your tool is standing straight up. You don't want to be cutting at an angle inwards or outwards. All right, and then cut your whole circle out. And then remove those scraps and put it in a scrap bag. Okay, so next step, we have our cylinder made. We have our base cut out so that it matches our cylindrical form. And next step is to attach our base to our cylinder. So again, we're going to follow that same three-step process of score, slip, and blend. So step one is to go around and score along the very outside edge. So we're not scoring the outside, we're scoring the top. And you can make your score marks a little bit bigger than the actual thickness of your slab because we're going to want to do some blending on the inside. We're going to add that coil and we're going to want to do some extra blending. So feel free to make some extra score marks and we're going to smooth all that out again later. Next up, we want to blend the base. So right here is our top. This is the area that we had thinned down a little bit, rounded the edges. So we're going to want to flip this upside down. So again, carefully using both hands, supporting, rotating it very carefully. We'll flip it upside down and we'll go ahead and score the entire bottom of our cylinder. Okay, so both are scored. Now we're ready to slip. Again, because this clay is still fairly plastic, slipping on just one side is probably good enough. So I'm just going to add a little bit of slip or water. And then I'll just go over that again, score again, and make sure we've got a nice, good Velcro surface. Okay, so scored, slipped. Now we're going to attach. So again, use both hands, carefully flip it up, and we're going to set it directly on top of our base. Before we do anything, we want to go around and make sure that it is totally lining up. It's not hanging out one side. It's not, we don't have a gap. So like this side, I need to kind of pop in a little bit. It's kind of hanging out. My cylinder shape got a little deformed. This side, I need to kind of pop out a little bit. So very carefully going around and making sure that it lines up. You guys can see maybe right here, it's kind of got pushed in. So I'm going to carefully take my fingers and push that out so it lines up with my base. Okay, so now that it's lined up, I'm just going to take my hands, cup, and just give it a little gentle wiggle so it seals. And then lift it up. It should be able to stick on now if you scored and slipped. And we're just going to give it a gentle couple taps. Again, nothing too aggressive because that would actually collapse your form. So just gentle little taps to seal the clay. Make sure that we don't have any air bubbles trapped inside. Okay, so now we can focus on the inside, and that is adding our coil. Right now, you guys can still see that we have those score marks and we have a pretty sharp corner seam. Normally when you look at a mug, the inside bottom is rounded so that when you're drinking out of it and cleaning it, it's easy to clean and you don't get any particles stuck in a sharp corner that you have to dig out. So we're going to go ahead and fill in our bottom corner with a coil. So at this point, if you don't have any fresh scrap open, go ahead and grab a little piece of clay. So this was the scrap that I had misted and put back into our scrap bag. So I'm just going to use a little bit of this. Again, remember to wedge it. So if you have any moisture on the surface, it gets kneaded back in, and you're going to be using really nice plastic clay. Okay, so next step is rolling out a coil. So this is the same process as how we made our foot. We're simply going to create that sausage shape and then take both of our hands and roll out a long rope. So I'm using both my hands and I'm making sure the coil rolls all the way back and forth, not just little rocking motions. And for this particular coil, we want it to be fairly thin because we want it just to fill in that little gap. So I probably have a little too much clay here, which is fine. So the thickness that we want for this is probably that 1/4 inch pencil thickness, and you want it to be long enough to wrap around the whole outside. So I'll make this just a little bit longer, and I think that should be good. Yes. All right. So just a small coil that we're going to blend. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to score the surface. So I'm going to score all the way down, maybe roll it over, just in case it kind of curves. It'll have score marks kind of on the whole thing. I already have those score marks around the bottom, so that will be helpful. And then next, I'm just going to add a little bit of slip. So you could either add some slip to your coil, or you could go down and with your paintbrush, add a little slip around that corner. So up to you, whatever you prefer. Maybe I'll do half and half just to show you guys. So you don't need much because again, both of these are still fairly plastic. Okay, so I'm going to put the slip side on this side and the unslip side on the side that I did before. So we'll just drop that coil in there, and you can use either your hand if you can reach down there. If you can't, go ahead and grab a modeling tool, and you can use that to kind of rearrange your coil. Make sure it goes right up to the edges. If you have extra, if your coil is too long, you can go ahead and just trim off that excess and fit it in around the bottom. Okay, so it looks like that. And now we blend. Okay, so for this one, again, you might be using your modeling tool so that you have basically an extended finger, or if you can fit your hand inside, you can use your finger, whichever one is more comfortable to you. You do want to be really cautious about not bumping the top and digging, scratches into it and deforming the piece. So support your hand on the outside so that when you blend the coil in, it won't push the form out and distort your shape. Okay, So you just do that all the way around. I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then we'll move on to the next step. All right, so just a couple little tips as you guys are blending. So step one, I went in and kind of pushed it down around the base and make sure I'm supporting so I don't pop out the wall. I don't pop the scene out. So I just press that down, and then you're taking your modeling tool and you're blending some up and you're blending some in, and then you can go side to side to smooth everything out. Okay. All right, so next step, so we have our coil fully blended in. So our goal is that you do not see any seams, creases of where two separate pieces of clay were. You might have some scratches down there. So if you're not able to use your hand to blend them out, I just like to use the paintbrush. Again, if you have lots of extra slip on your brush, probably remove that. So it's just slightly damp. And you can use your paintbrush to go in there and refine any little scratches, smooth out any little areas that maybe got a little bit cut up with your blending tool. Okay, I don't know if you guys can see that. Just going through, cleaning up some of those areas and smoothing out any major scratch areas. Okay? All right, so we've got our inside blended, and then the last step here for the cylinder is to simply smooth out the outside. So probably while you were working and supporting, you probably already smushed it a little bit, but if you still see any kind of seam area where you can see the difference between your cylindrical slab and your base slab, you just simply want to go over there and blend it out. So simply by supporting your hand, taking your finger, and smoothing it out. I think your finger works way better than the modeling tool for smoothing a rounded shape. So we'll just take that, use my bat as kind of that turntable concept. So I'm just in a position and I'm just going to turn my bat, spin it around, and get the entire outside smooth. So it looks like one solid piece of clay. Okay, of course, if you do have a texture, you would want to be a little bit cautious about not smearing the whole thing. Okay, so now we have our cylinder built. Coil on the inside, fully blended, it's smoothed, and the exterior has been blended and smoothed. We can double check that maybe our lip is still looking good. If we need to fix any cracks, smooth out maybe any little dings that we might have gotten while we were trying to work on the inside, and then putz with it a little bit and make sure that it is going to be in a cylindrical form and we have a circle. It's not lopsided. That wouldn't be very functional as a mug. Okay, so putz with it, get it to be in a nice, even, symmetrical circle as best as you can. And then we're going to let this get leather hard, cheese hard. So we'll take this, we'll wrap this in a piece of plastic, and we'll be ready for our next step, making our handles.